A millionaire disguised himself as a homeless man to test his own son. What this young man did next will leave you speechless. Get ready for a real story filled with twists and surprising lessons. When money and power step aside, true character emerges. And believe me, the outcome of this story will shock you. Harold had always been a man ahead of his time. At 72 years old, he had amassed an immense fortune thanks to his network of successful businesses. Widowed for 5 years, his greatest concern was his 30-year-old son, Oliver. Since childhood, Oliver had the best of everything, but Harold feared that excessive comfort had erased the values he and his late wife had cherished so much: respect, empathy, and humility. The past few months had left Harold uneasy. He began to notice that Oliver seemed more interested in status than in people. Cold comments, indifference toward employees, and an arrogant attitude had become frequent. So Harold decided he needed to act, but he wouldn't give lectures or moral lessons. No, he would create a situation where Oliver would have to show who he really was, without knowing he was being tested. That's when Harold had the idea. He would disguise himself as a homeless man and try to interact with his own son. If Oliver helped a stranger in need, it would be a good sign. But if he turned him away, Harold needed to prepare for any response. He crafted his disguise with meticulous detail. He bought old, torn, and dirty clothes from a thrift store in a distant neighborhood. He used dirt and oil to make the look even more convincing. He messed up his hair, let his beard grow, and practiced a hunched and tired posture. In the mirror, his reflection was that of a man the world had forgotten. On his first attempt, Harold chose the entrance to Oliver's office. He knew the time his son went out for lunch and sat on the sidewalk, holding a small cardboard sign that read, "Any help is welcome." Oliver appeared at the building's door, impeccably dressed, his phone in hand. Harold took a deep breath and extended his hand, not saying a word, just waiting for a gesture. Oliver walked right past him, not even glancing his way. The next day, Harold returned to the same spot, and the next day too. For a week he sat in the same spot, always trying to catch his son's attention. But Oliver seemed blind to everything around him. It was as if the world's problems simply didn't exist in his perfect reality. Determined to try a different approach, Harold changed his strategy. He chose a spot near the parking lot where Oliver kept his luxury car. On a cold and cloudy afternoon, he waited until he saw his son approaching. "Please, sir, could you help me?" His voice came out low, almost a whisper. Oliver stopped. He looked directly at his disguised father. For a brief moment, Harold thought maybe this was the moment of redemption. But what came next was a shock. "Get out of my way, you filthy old man." Those words were like a knife to Harold's chest. He stood there, frozen, as Oliver got into his car and drove away without looking back. For years, Harold believed he had raised a kind man, someone who understood the importance of lending a hand to those in need. But what he saw was indifference and disdain. Harold spent the night awake. Memories of young Oliver, always gentle and loving, clashed with the coldness of that man. What had happened over the years? Where had he gone wrong? However, Harold knew that rejection was just the beginning. To truly understand who his son was, he would need to dig deeper. And deep down, a part of him feared what he was about to discover. Harold woke up with a heavy body and an even more exhausted soul. The old mattress in the small rented apartment didn't help, but the real discomfort came from within. Every time he closed his eyes, the scene replayed. Oliver, his son, ignoring him as if he didn't exist. It was hard to accept. Throughout his life, Harold had taught his son about kindness, about seeing others. When Oliver was young, they used to bring hot soup to the homeless during the winter. The boy used to hold the wrinkled hands of those strangers, sharing genuine smiles. "Everyone deserves a little warmth, Dad," he would say. But that boy had disappeared. The man Harold saw on the street was cold, almost indifferent to human suffering, and it scared him. Determined to go deeper, Harold decided to follow Oliver. He wanted to understand if that coldness was just a reflection of a bad day, or if it had become part of who he was. On the first day, Harold saw him at work. Oliver walked through the office corridors like a king in his castle. His employees lowered their heads, avoiding eye contact. He didn't share smiles, only commands. When a young man dropped some papers on the floor, Oliver walked right by, almost stepping on the scattered sheets. During lunch, Harold followed him to a fancy restaurant. Oliver dined alone. It wasn't loneliness, it was a choice. He preferred silence over company. When the waitress accidentally spilled a bit of water on the table, he didn't hide his disdain. "You know what's worse than bad service?" he said, without even looking at her. "It's your lack of competence." The girl, visibly embarrassed, picked up the spilled glass and apologized. But Oliver just sighed, as if the simple act of responding to her was already a nuisance. Harold felt his chest tighten. It wasn't just an isolated attitude. That coldness seemed to be ingrained in Oliver. Over the following days, the pattern repeated. On the street, Oliver avoided beggars. At work, he treated colleagues like disposable pieces. At home, from what Harold could observe, there were no signs of friends or relationships. Oliver lived surrounded by comfort, but there was no warmth. On a rainy afternoon, Harold followed his son to a park. Oliver sat on a bench under a dry tree, staring into the void. A stray dog approached, wagging its tail. Harold watched, hoping for a reaction. Maybe there, away from the world's eyes, the real Oliver would emerge. But his son simply lifted his foot and shooed the animal away. "Go away!" The voice was low but sharp. The dog recoiled, tail between its legs. Harold felt his eyes burn. It couldn't be that his son had become someone incapable of showing even a hint of affection. A mix of sadness and anger washed over him. That night, sitting on the hard mattress, Harold replayed every moment of Oliver's childhood. The nights he told him bedtime stories. The times they camped in the backyard, laughing under the starry sky. He couldn't understand where he had failed. However, giving up was not an option. If coldness had taken over Oliver's heart, Harold would take it upon himself to warm it again. Even if he had to face his son's indifference, even if he had to look at that ice barrier and get hurt, he wouldn't back down. He decided to try a new approach. The next day, he dressed up as a homeless man again and waited for Oliver to leave the office. This time he didn't just hold out his hand. "Please, sir, I'm hungry. Just a piece of bread." Oliver stopped. He looked directly at Harold, and for a moment, the father believed he had touched something inside him. But what followed was a shock. "If you're hungry, work. The world doesn't owe you anything." Harold felt the impact of those words like a blow. He stood there, motionless, as Oliver walked away, unfazed. And for the first time, Harold realized that the real challenge wasn't just discovering what had happened to his son. It was accepting that maybe Oliver had always been this way. And to save him, he would need to find a way to break through that hard shell, even if it meant confronting the harshest truths. Harold understood that Oliver's coldness wasn't temporary. It was a thick and old layer, and to break it, he would need to go beyond the disguise. He would have to reach his son where he least expected, straight into his heart. The days that followed were a mix of pain and hope for Harold. Every step he took toward Oliver seemed to lead him deeper into an even darker maze. The son he thought he knew had turned into a stranger, someone whose motivations were hard to grasp. But a father's love, even when wounded, pushed him forward. The morning after their last encounter, Harold decided to try a new approach. He abandoned his homeless disguise and began following Oliver through his daily routine. He wanted to observe his son without interference, as if he could find a crack in the armor of coldness he wore. At work, Oliver was respected, or rather, feared. He gave quick orders, shut down discussions with a look, and seemed to have no patience for mistakes. When a young intern dropped a stack of documents, Oliver didn't hesitate to reprimand him in front of everyone. "If you can't handle a simple task, maybe this isn't the place for you." The room sank into an awkward silence. The young man gathered the papers with trembling hands, his face red with embarrassment. Watching from afar, Harold felt his chest tighten. It was hard to connect that man with the boy who used to run around the house laughing, always ready to help anyone. That afternoon, Harold followed Oliver to a restaurant. His son sat alone as usual. The waitress approached, and while taking his order, she accidentally dropped a napkin on the table. "Sorry, sir, Incompetence isn't excusable. If you can't hold a napkin, maybe you should find another job." The young woman swallowed her tears and walked away. Around them, people averted their gaze, pretending nothing had happened. Harold, sitting at a distant table, had to fight the urge to get up. His mind screamed at him to go over, grab his son by the shoulders and make him see the harm he was causing. But his heart told him it wasn't time yet. After lunch, Oliver returned to the office. Harold waited for his son to leave at the end of the day and followed him to a nearby park. Oliver sat on a bench, pulled out his phone, and began scrolling through the screen absent-mindedly. A boy, around 8 years old, approached him. He was holding an old ball and looked lost. "Sir, have you seen my mom?" Oliver ignored him. "Mister, can't you see I'm busy?" His voice came out cold, emotionless. "Look for your mom somewhere else." The boy walked away, his eyes brimming with tears. Harold felt his blood boil. It couldn't be that his son had lost all traces of humanity. He stood up, ready to step in, but was interrupted by a hurried woman who hugged the boy and led him away, throwing a reproachful look at Oliver. That night, Harold returned to the small apartment where he was staying. The solitude of the empty walls seemed to reflect the emptiness he felt inside. He picked up an old photo of Oliver as a child, holding the first fish he had ever caught. In the image, the boy was smiling, his eyes shining with pride. It was a smile full of life, so far from the empty look he had now. Harold needed to understand what had happened. It wasn't just about Oliver's cold behavior. It was about the lack of empathy, the inability to see others. He decided he needed help and contacted an old family friend, Pastor John, who had known Oliver since he was young. The next morning, Harold met John at a small cafe. He told him everything he had seen, every harsh action and every cold word. "I don't understand, John. I raised Oliver with so much love. Where did I go wrong?" John took a deep breath. "Sometimes the heart hardens because of experiences, Harold. Maybe it wasn't something you did, but something he went through alone. But he never talks about anything. There's no room for feelings in his life. Then you need to create that space. Show him that even if he's lost, love is still there." At that moment, Harold realized he needed to take a more direct approach. He decided to return to his homeless disguise. But this time, it wouldn't be a subtle approach. He needed to provoke a situation that would put Oliver at an emotional crossroads. 2 days later, Harold returned to the same park bench where Oliver often sat. He put on the worn-out clothes, dirtied his face, and prepared for what was to come. When he saw his son approaching, he pretended to feel unwell. He let himself fall to the ground, breathing heavily, his hand over his chest. Oliver stopped. He looked at Harold lying there while the people around hesitated, waiting for someone to take the lead. And then, as if the world was in slow motion, Oliver took a step back, and another. He turned and walked away without looking back. Harold stayed there, motionless, not because of the act, but because of the reality that scene revealed. His son had chosen the easier path, indifference. Watching Oliver walk away, Harold realized the hole in his son's heart was deeper than he had imagined. And to save him, he would have to face not only Oliver's coldness, but also the pain of watching his son drift further away. Harold remained on the park ground for long minutes. The world around him seemed to spin slowly, as if every movement in the distance was a faint echo. People passed by, some stopped to ask if he needed help, but none of them were the one he needed most in that moment. Oliver had gone. His own son had left him behind without hesitation. A kind man, dressed simply, helped him up. His name was Patrick, a volunteer at a nearby shelter. Harold thanked him with a weak smile, and still shaken, accepted the invitation to see the shelter's work. It was a humble place but full of life. People came and went, receiving clothes, hot meals, and above all, attention. Walking through the halls, Harold felt a pang of guilt. For days he had disguised himself as a homeless man, but here were people who truly lived that reality, and at the same time, the place brought him an unexpected sense of comfort. It was as if, amid the pain, he had found a small island of humanity. Patrick, noticing Harold's distant gaze, invited him to sit and talk. The old businessman, whose life had once seemed so structured, began to speak. At first, cautiously, but soon the words poured out uncontrollably. He spoke about Oliver, the sweet boy he had been, the cold man he had become. "I saw him leave me on the ground today," Harold said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know if I can save him." Patrick, with the patience of someone who had heard many difficult stories, remained calm. "Sometimes people get lost, and often they don't want to be found. But the fact that you're still trying, that's already something huge. But what if he never changes? What if this coldness is who he really is? Then maybe you need to find a way to accept that. Not by giving up on your love, but by understanding that love is sometimes waiting without guarantees." Those words echoed in Harold's mind. Waiting without guarantees. That was exactly how he felt. Every attempt to get close to Oliver seemed to hit a wall of indifference. Yet, as a father, he knew he couldn't give up. Even if he had to endure the pain of seeing his son grow more distant, he had to keep trying. The next day, Harold invited Oliver to the shelter. Reluctantly, Oliver agreed. As they walked through the shelter, Oliver's expression remained stoic. Even surrounded by so many raw realities, he seemed untouched. When a young boy handed Harold a colorful drawing, Oliver watched in silence. In the car, Oliver finally asked, "Why do you do this, Dad?" "Because I know the value of a helping hand. Because I believe that even in the darkness, there's always a light." Oliver didn't respond. He just drove, dropping Harold off, then left without saying goodbye. For Harold, it wasn't much, but it was a start. The days dragged on slowly. Every morning, Harold woke up hoping Oliver would call, send a message, or at least show some sign that what he had seen at the shelter had made an impact. But the silence remained. Harold continued his routine at the shelter. Every meal served, every conversation with the residents reinforced his faith in human kindness. He saw people with so little sharing what they had left. He saw strangers supporting each other in moments of despair. And in every shy smile he received, he felt he was on the right path. However, Oliver's absence was an open wound. Sometimes Harold would stop in the middle of the dining hall, his gaze lost, trying to understand where everything had started to fall apart. He wondered if at some point he had paid more attention to business than to his son, if he had gotten lost in the pursuit of success and neglected what truly mattered. One cloudy afternoon, while handing out warm clothes, Harold was surprised by Patrick. "Harold, someone's here to see you outside." The old father's heart skipped a beat. Could it be Oliver? He quickly took off his gloves, wiped his hands on his apron, and walked to the entrance. But when he opened the door, it wasn't his son standing there, but an unfamiliar woman with a tense expression. "Are you Harold?" "Yes, that's me. My name is Diane. I work at your son's company." Harold's heart tightened. Did something happen to Oliver? Diane looked around as if not wanting to be seen. I don't know how to say this, but your son is about to make a terrible decision. He's planning to lay off an entire team at the company to increase profits. These are family people, folks who depend on this job, and he doesn't care. Harold felt a chill run through him. But why? He said the company needs to be more profitable, that feelings don't pay bills. Diane took a deep breath, her voice trembling. "I know I shouldn't be here, but I saw you at the shelter. I saw how you treat people. I thought, maybe you could talk to him." Harold thanked her, and without wasting time, grabbed his coat. If there was a chance to stop that decision, he needed to act fast. When he arrived at the company, he went straight to Oliver's office. The secretary tried to stop him, but he didn't hesitate. He opened the door and found his son behind the desk, signing papers. "Dad, what are you doing here?" "I should be asking you, Oliver. What are you about to do?" Oliver put down his pen and crossed his arms. "I'm making tough decisions. Something you never had the courage to do." Harold took a step forward, his gaze steady. "Firing honest people isn't being courageous, it's being cruel. It's not about cruelty, it's about business. If the company doesn't make a profit, everyone loses." "Profit? How much more do you need? Don't you have enough already?" Oliver sighed, irritated. "You never understood, Dad. For you it was always easy. Kindness is a privilege for those who don't have to worry about tomorrow. I worked hard to give you a good life, Oliver, so you'd never have to choose between profit and humanity. And maybe that was the problem. You gave me so much that I never knew the real value of anything." Harold felt the weight of those words. "Then let me show you. Come with me. Now." Oliver chuckled, incredulous. "To where? Another shelter? Another moral lesson?" "No, to real life, to see what your decisions cause." After much resistance, Oliver agreed. Harold took him to the home of one of the employees who were about to be laid off. It was a simple house in a modest neighborhood. A woman opened the door, holding a baby in her arms and a curly-haired girl clinging to her skirt. "Mrs. Emily?" Harold asked. "I'm Harold, and this is Oliver, from the company where your husband works." Emily smiled, not knowing the reason for the visit. "Oh, of course. Paul speaks so highly of you. He always says he's lucky to work at such a good company." Oliver remained silent. "Can we talk to him?" "Unfortunately, he's still in the hospital. But he should be home next week. The doctor said he'll recover well." "Hospital?" Oliver finally spoke. Yes, he had an accident at the construction site, but we're so grateful that the company kept his job. It's given us security. And this little one here is about to start school soon, right, sweetheart? The girl smiled, shy. Harold saw the change in Oliver's face. It wasn't a complete transformation, but a small crack in his stone-cold expression. On the drive back, the silence in the car was almost tangible. Is this what you're going to do, Oliver? Take the job away from a sick man? Leave a family without support? Oliver didn't respond. He just drove back to the office and, without saying anything, walked into his office and tore up the layoff papers. Are you happy now, Dad? Harold didn't answer. He just placed his hand on his son's shoulder, a soft touch, but full of meaning. That night, for the first time in a long while, Harold slept with a little bit of hope. He didn't know if Oliver had truly changed, but that gesture was a start. And for a father, even the smallest sign of light was enough to keep moving forward. Oliver had torn up the layoff papers, but did that mean a genuine change or just an attempt to please his father? Harold knew the real test was yet to come. The days that followed were strangely calm. Harold continued his work at the shelter, but this time, without the constant weight of pain. The visit to Emily's house had left a mark on Oliver. Harold was sure of it. His son seemed to have glimpsed, even if just for a moment, the real impact of his decisions. However, Harold knew that one isolated action wasn't enough. The human heart was complicated, and true change required more than just a spark. It needed constant fuel, internal confrontations, and above all, sincerity. To his surprise, Oliver started visiting him at the shelter. At first, he always showed up at the end of the day as if he wanted to avoid interacting with people. He stayed in the kitchen, helping wash dishes or organize donations. Harold didn't push him. He simply cherished those moments with his son, even in silence. As time went on, Oliver began to open up. He started serving meals, exchanged a few words with the residents, and even helped organize fundraising events. Although he still maintained a reserved demeanor, small gestures began to surface. Gestures that would have been unthinkable before. A soft smile when he saw a child having fun, a sincere thank you when receiving a plate of food from Patrick. One day, while they were packing donated clothes, Patrick pulled Harold aside. Your son's been coming around a lot, hasn't he? Harold nodded, his face a mix of pride and caution. Yes, he's been a big help. And do you believe he's truly changed? The question hung in the air. Harold didn't know how to answer. I want to believe, Patrick, but only time will tell. That same afternoon, Harold saw Oliver sitting alone in the shelter's courtyard. He decided to sit down next to him. It's been a while since we've had a real conversation, hasn't it? Harold started, his voice gentle. Oliver remained silent but didn't move away. I know that over the past few months I've done things you don't understand, things that might have seemed intrusive. You dressed up as a homeless man, Dad. Oliver finally spoke, a hint of irony in his tone. I think intrusive is putting it lightly. Harold laughed, and it was a genuine laugh, something he hadn't felt in a long time. I needed to understand what was going on. He paused. And to be honest, I didn't like what I saw. Oliver pressed his lips together. Neither did I. The confession caught Harold by surprise. Then why, son? Why the coldness? Oliver lowered his head. For long seconds, only the sound of the wind filled the space between them. I think I got lost. His voice came out low, almost a whisper. When Mom died, I didn't know how to cope. You buried yourself in work, and I did the same. But instead of connecting with people, I built walls. I thought if nothing affected me, I'd never hurt again. Harold felt tears well up. I should have been there for you. No, Dad. Oliver looked into his father's eyes for the first time without that veil of indifference. I'm responsible for my own choices. And I chose the easy path, the path of coldness. The hug that followed was silent but filled with meaning. Harold felt the weight of years of distance melt away in that moment. In the days that followed, Oliver continued going to the shelter. But now, he no longer hid. He began to participate actively, organizing donations, talking to the residents, helping wherever needed. It was a slow process, but a genuine one. One afternoon, while they were handing out blankets to a newly arrived family, Harold saw something that warmed his heart. Oliver crouched down to a child's level, handing over a stuffed teddy bear. The boy smiled and hugged him, and for the first time, Harold saw a genuine glow of empathy on his son's face. When the day ended, they walked to the car together. "I don't know if I'm doing this right, Dad," Oliver confessed. "I still feel like it's hard to connect." "No one expects perfection, son. Just keep trying." Oliver nodded. "I want to. For the first time in a long time, I really want to." Harold finally saw the change in his son. However, even with this transformation, he knew the past wouldn't disappear so easily. The true test would come when Oliver needed to keep his heart open even in the face of difficulties. And for that, the biggest challenge was still ahead. The following months were like a tree blooming in winter. Every small gesture from Oliver was a new leaf, a sign that even the driest soil, when well cared for, could bear fruit. Harold watched his son transform, not just in his actions, but in the way he viewed the world. At the shelter, Oliver became more than just a volunteer. He started bringing in ideas, organized fundraising campaigns, and used his administrative skills to optimize resources. Over time, he earned the trust of those around him. His former coldness was replaced by a gentle seriousness, a way to connect with others while staying true to his naturally reserved nature. But, as Harold knew, life always finds ways to test the new foundations we build. On a cold morning, while preparing breakfast at the shelter, a commotion arose at the entrance. Harold and Oliver rushed over and found a desperate woman with 2 small children clinging to her legs. "Please help us. We were evicted. We have nowhere to go." Oliver froze. Memories of the visit to Emily's house flooded back. But this time he didn't hesitate. "Come inside, we'll take care of you." The woman cried with relief, and Harold felt his pride overflow. As they set up a place for the family to stay, Harold noticed that Oliver seemed different, not just because of his welcoming attitude, but because of the distant look in his eyes, as if a silent battle was raging inside him. Later, when he found him sitting alone in the courtyard, Harold sat down beside him. "Are you okay, son?" Oliver remained quiet for a few seconds. "I keep thinking, how many people have I treated with indifference? How many times did someone need help and I turned away?" Harold sat next to him. "We can't change the past, Oliver, but every gesture today builds the future." "I know, but sometimes the weight of it all suffocates me. Regret is a sign that your heart is alive, and that's already a victory." Oliver sighed, but this time, not with impatience. "I just want to do the right thing." And he did. Over the following weeks, Oliver stayed close to the woman and her children. He found her a temporary job, organized clothing donations, and even helped secure a small house where they could start over. On moving day, as the woman hugged Oliver in gratitude, Harold saw his son holding back tears. "You were incredible, son." "No," Oliver replied, his tone humble. "I just did what I should have done all along." That night, as they returned home, Harold received an unexpected call. It was from the company's board. They were concerned about Oliver's change in behavior. His more humane decisions had reduced profits, and some shareholders were not pleased. "You need to make a choice, Oliver." The board president's voice was firm. "Either keep the company profitable or we'll need to find new leadership." Harold watched his son, waiting for his response. "If the company can't be fair and profitable at the same time, maybe I'm not the right leader." Silence hung on the other end of the line before the call ended abruptly. Oliver had chosen the harder path, the only path his heart could accept. The following week, he announced his departure from the company. He returned his shares, ensured no employees would be hurt by the transition, and as he walked out of the office for the last time, he felt lighter than he had in years. Harold was waiting at the door, greeting him with a warm hug. "So, what now? What will you do?" Oliver smiled. "I think the shelter could use another volunteer." They both laughed, and the sound echoed like a promise of new beginnings. At the shelter, Oliver found his place. Not only did he help, but he was also helped. Every story he heard, every hand he held, was a quiet healing for his own wounds. One day, while serving lunch, the little girl from the park approached him. She held a new drawing, filled with bright colors and wobbly shapes. "This is for you, mister." Oliver took the paper, and for the first time, he didn't just smile. He cried. Tears of happiness, relief, and hope. Watching from afar, Harold understood that the moment had come to let his son go. Oliver had found his path, and though the road ahead was long, he knew the young man would walk it with an open heart. And for a father, there was no greater reward than that. And now imagine yourself in Harold's place. Would you have had the same patience and hope? What would you have done differently? Let me know in the comments. Stay tuned for another heartwarming story coming up on the next screen. See you there.